Neil Gaiman asked, do you have a moment to talk about all of our Lord and Saviors? I discussed this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read, one that is about gods and coin tricks and mythology and all sorts of things like that. I am referring to American Gods by Neil Gaiman, which was published in 2001. I've already talked about Neil Gaiman on this channel before, one of my favorite authors, especially as I've been reading more of his work. Whether it be the Sandman series or American Gods right here, or Neverwhere, which I didn't quite enjoy, or Stardust, which is one of his better works, or The Ocean at the End of the Lane. All high quality reads, and he's won a number of awards for his work. Very well regarded, and this is probably one of my favorite books. Probably I'll talk more about it later, but this is probably one of the best books of all time, and I don't say that lightly on this channel. I actually read this book in high school, and then I read it again in 2015, and so this is my third time reading it. And I should point out that this book is ineligible for best of the year awards or anything like that, or for myself, because I've already read it. I feel like it would just naturally take place, but I want to save that for books I've read the first time over, like just the first time books. Whereas if I end up doing that for every book, or if I make every book eligible, then it'll just be filled with stuff I've already read before, and that's not fun or interesting at all. But without further ado, let's talk about American Gods, a high-quality book. When I do my summary and analysis, I will avoid spoiling it, but that just applies to the summary. I will spoil it in the analysis section because it's kind of hard not to do that. But if you are interested in going out and reading it, I suggest you do that now and then come back and watch this video. So without further ado, I'm going to do a summary and an analysis, and we will move on from there. So American Gods focuses on Shadow Moon. He is a prisoner who is set to be released pretty soon, and he's excited because he's going to reunite with his wife, as well as be able to work on his friend's mussel farm, which he'll have a job and everything will be good for him. However, he is told by the prison warden that his wife has died, and so he's being let out a few days early to go to the funeral, which is sad. And as he's flying home, he runs into a man named Mr. Wednesday, who is mysterious, and Shadow kind of clocks him as a con man. Mr. Wednesday offers him a job, but Shadow rejects because he already has something lined up. And then he encounters him again when he gets to his hometown, wondering how Mr. Wednesday was able to find him. But again, he rejects the initial offer, although there is some interest in Mr. Wednesday. Throughout the story, we also see a number of vignettes and side chapters, short stories about the older gods, about the people who worshipped them, the cycle of gods and the death of gods, and various things like that. Very fascinating chapters, I should say. And as he gets to his hometown, Shadow is there for Laura's funeral, and he finds out that the guy who was going to offer him a job at the mussel farm died, because he died in the same car crash that Laura was in, because they were having an affair, which his wife didn't really like. And later at a motel, Shadow actually encounters Laura, who is who is dead, but is still like walking about. And she apologizes for cheating on him, but notes that she had needs too. Just noting that she's sad and she seems to be decaying. And she kind of follows Shadow through the rest of the story, protecting him when necessary. And because he doesn't really have a job, Shadow decides at that point to accept Mr. Wednesday's job offer. Shadow accepts the offer on the condition that he doesn't have to hurt anybody, which Wednesday says he probably won't have to do. But they engage in some con jobs in order to make some money. They go around meeting strange people who take a liking to Shadow, but don't really... they're not really clear about who they are or anything like that. They eventually make their way to a tourist attraction where they find a carousel. And on that carousel, Shadow learns that these people are gods. Old gods from Europe and various other locations. And it turns out that Wednesday is actually Odin. Who is recruiting all of the gods for an upcoming war that is to take place with the new gods, who we see throughout this story. Wednesday says that this battle is inevitable, and he's recruiting these people. Some are willing to join him, others take a little bit more persuading, but he knows that they'll be on his side soon enough. And Mr. Wednesday takes everyone to a restaurant afterwards to celebrate, but it's at that point that the new gods intervene and their agents capture Shadow and interrogate him to find out what Mr. Wednesday wants. Shadow doesn't reveal anything, but Laura shows up and she kills these people who are sort of guarding him, and Shadow manages to escape, heading across the countryside to a place called Cairo, which is where two men named Ibis and Jackal are staying. They reveal themselves to be ancient Egyptian gods and allow Shadow to stay with them while they do funeral home stuff. Revealing a little bit more about Egyptian mythology there. Eventually, Mr. Wednesday shows back up, and they're reunited, and Mr. Wednesday orders him to stay in a town called Lakeside to lay low while he goes and does his business. And Shadow seems to like Lakeside, likes the people, but it is a bit of a mysterious city, and some teenagers seem to go missing, which we find out why at the very end of the story. But one night, Shadow has a dream about thunderbirds, which seems to draw attention to him from the other gods in the world. And so Mr. Wednesday orders him to go to San Francisco and help him recruit a woman named Easter. Easter is happy that people still worship her, but Wednesday points out that people are doing this more out of muscle memory than anything else. They don't actually remember what Easter was truly about, which makes Easter sad, but she still decides to join Wednesday on his endeavor. They then head back, but they have to sort of go behind the scenes to avoid these agents of the new gods. They encounter a man named Whiskey Jack and also Johnny Appleseed. And Whiskey Jack notes that he has doubts that the old gods can even win, and that when Wednesday fails, he's more than welcome to come back to Whiskey Jack to have some food and whatnot. Although this seems to anger Wednesday, he's a bit more agitated because maybe he realizes that Whiskey Jack is possibly correct. And then Shadow stays in Lakeside for a little bit longer. However, some people from his past show up and reveal that he's actually an ex-con who's skipped his parole, so he's arrested. But thankfully, Mr. Nancy and a couple of other characters who he's already passed by come and free him and take care of him. And while that's happening, Wednesday goes to a sort of truce meeting with the new gods to broker a truce, but he's apparently killed in the process. Which only seems to make the other old gods sort of vigilant and willing to fight on his behalf at that point. And from there, the rest of the story takes place. Again, I won't spoil it in the summary section here, but a lot of interesting things happen. In terms of analysis, boy, howdy, what a story. As I've said before, this is my third time reading this story. The first time was in high school around 2008. I thought it was a very fascinating and high-quality book, but I didn't really understand it that much. And that's possibly because I lacked a lot of knowledge about mythology and who Neil Gaiman was as a writer. And I read it again in around 2015, and I think I appreciated it a bit more. But in the year of our Lord 2024, I read it again, and I I've known more about mythology now. I know more about Neil Gaiman, and I can see exactly what he's doing here. And this really feels like a culmination of everything Neil Gaiman has written, kind of like Neil Gaiman distilled to a single book in like 800 or so, 755-ish kind of pages. So very fascinating, and I do consider this to be one of the best books ever written. Just so finely detailed and well, like with amazing prose and like fascinating themes. Definitely high quality. But some of the ideas that Neil Gaiman is working with here, one of them is mythology, of course. Neil Gaiman utilizes existing mythology and folklore and adds something new to these mythologies, or like blends them together in a way that's pretty novel. Having characters or gods or folklore characters interact in a way that they wouldn't normally do in real life because they never had that opportunity to interact. And so you see a whole bunch of things like Norse god, you see Odin, you see Loki in this story, you hear about Thor, you see some worship, you see sacrifice in this story, you see demons, you see ritual, you see resurrection. And one of the more interesting aspects that I hadn't caught before, but I caught this time, is not only does Shadow hang in the world tree in this story in a manner resembling Odin, but he also is sort of crucified in this story. He's poked by a large stick, and that causes his resurrection, which leads to some of the other events in this story. So it's very fascinating that he manages to use both the resurrection and the sort of hanging in the world tree, and then blends them together to affect events in this story. And then you also see the afterlife, which is kind of a blend of a bunch of different ones, but it mostly utilizes Egyptian sort of folklore about what happens in the afterworld, which is pretty fascinating. You get Shadow's soul being weighed by Anubis and other such characters, and a threat of him being devoured by a soul eater if he's not pure enough or something like that. So you see a lot of mythology here, a lot of evidence to show that Gaiman clearly did his research, which is fascinating. But what's also interesting is you might see some allusions to Ragnarok in this story in particular. After all, there is a big sort of world-ending fight that takes place with Norse characters. And as I'll allude to earlier, it's kind of mentioned in the setting of the story that you have this huge winter breaking out and things aren't what they used to be. So again, he's kind of blending the old with the new here and creating something different. And so like Gaiman is telling those new stories. Like, for example, Ibis and Jekyll are Egyptian gods, but they operate a funeral home now. And so the way that they're judging people in the afterlife is through the people who die and end up in their funeral home. And then you also he's also creating a cultural hero. Like he mentions that Whiskey Jack is a cultural hero among some native tribes, and cultural heroes are kind of like gods, but they have they might not have as much power, and they're as Whiskey Jack says, like they tell the bad stories in addition to the good about you. So you're not really made to look completely infallible. And you could argue that Shadow is a cultural hero in the context of this story. Just a character who's kind of manipulated by gods, but also does amazing things in order to bring about some sense of justice for the gods and maybe advocate on the behalf of humanity. So Gaiman is kind of creating something new, wholly new, out of this. In addition to all of the mythology and stories that he's borrowing from these other cultures, and in essence, this is fully distilled Gaiman because this is what he's been doing since the 1980s. He did it a little bit with the Sandman. He did it with The Ocean at the End of the Lane, which I think actually came after this. He probably did it with Good Omens because that was based on the Christian religion and whatnot. So you see, Gaiman has been doing this for a while, but here's like the essence of Neil Gaiman. If you wanted to know what Neil Gaiman was all about, if you could only read one of his books, it would probably be this one. Another big theme that pops up throughout the story is the old gods versus the new gods. The main conflict in this story stems from the dispute between the established versus the rising or the newer sort of beings that have been there. After all, there's only so many people that can be worship or that can do worship. Like there's only so many people on this planet, only so many minds that you can influence, and you can't get one person to really worship every god, because that would be unfeasible, like illogical. Like why would you worship, Egyptian gods and Greek gods and Norse gods and modern gods? It wouldn't really make a lot of sense. It would kind of conflict and contradict each other. And although humans are full of contradictions, they are not that full of contradictions. And so everyone's kind of like fighting over these minds, these people, and they know there's not enough to go around, so something's got to give. And some characters are in favor of letting these old gods die. Like we don't need to go to war with them. We need to just outlast them, which is possible, and in fact it has happened in this story before. But due to the events of the plot and the schemes that are taking place, that's not exactly a feasible option. And so instead, there's just like this desire to go to war because only one person can be in charge of everything. Or not one person, but one group of people can be in charge. And then in addition to that, there's also that fear of being forgotten. That being forgotten leads to your death. And for gods who don't really die, unless something like stabs you or something like that, like if you don't come into any problems, you're not going to feel pain like that. You're not going to die. But being forgotten creates a great sense of pain and a great existential terror that not everyone wants to experience. And so you'd much rather go to war for the right to be worshipped than you would to just simply accept that death. And there's a big question of like, who is right in this story? The new gods, who rightfully recognize that this is a cycle and this happens, and that the old gods need to let the new gods have their moment in the light, or the old gods, who shouldn't just be discarded like trash and still have a place in the world. You can kind of make an argument for either there. But as Mr. Wednesday says, it kind of creates a dangerous sense that if both sides believe they're right, as has been the case throughout history. Allow me to read you an interesting quote about this. "There's never been a true war that wasn't fought between two sets of people who were certain they were in the right. The really dangerous people believe that they are doing whatever they are doing solely and only because it is without question the right thing to do. And that is what makes them dangerous." And that's a good quote that you see that kind of idea expressed throughout the story, that Shadow's like, these people believe that they're the white hats. They believe that they're good guys. And Wednesday's like, of course they do. They have to believe they're right. Otherwise, why are they doing any of this? And, that also makes them dangerous, because they're true believers in the cause. They're going to do the most dangerous thing possible to ensure that the cause is going forward, that everything is working out for them. So if you ask the question, who is right, that's not really a good question to ask, I think. I think the better question is, why do they think they're right? And is there credence to their argument? And I do think that both sides kind of have a good point to make here. Although the new gods are doing it in a very brutal kind of manner. But again, as we find out, they're being manipulated in the process. And even like the technical boy just believes that it'd be best to let nature take the course and have them be forgotten eventually. What's also interesting is that maybe this is just a natural thing, as pointed out by Gaiman in the story, that the process of forgetting just happens, and that the old gods just have to accept that this is how their life course goes. They're given a lot of power through worship, and then they're eventually forgotten, and then new gods take their place. We see that with one of of the vignettes in the story where one of the older gods, Nunyanini, I believe it's the name, followed the people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge in the ancient times, and was worshipped in America for a period of time before eventually people forgot, and like new gods took their place. It's also said that like a raven god took their place, and given that ravens are associated with Odin, it could be implied that Odin was part of this process itself. Like he helped push away the older gods and was a new god at one point. And so that him complaining about it is just him failing to recognize that this is a cycle of old, the new, old, the new, old, the new, old, the new, and then the old is forgotten. Kind of like the death with humans. And so, it does seem to be a part of an overarching process, a cycle, which Neil Gaiman is great at showing. But what's also interesting is that the twist of the story shows that this was all engineered by Odin and Loki as a means of diversion. It's not the war that's taking place that matters. This was all kind of like pushed forward by Odin in order to gain more power, because his death in the story means that he gets worshipped in some way. That by dying for the cause, like people worship him and now do more bloodshed in his name. And the same applies for Loki. A big theme of this story is that of the con job. So that shows you that. But given that this is all on Odin and Loki's part, it kind of puts a tragic spin on this fight between the old and the new, because it doesn't need to be this place. As Gaiman shows, like, this is a cycle. So if it's a cycle, these people are all being tricked into fighting for really a cause that's not all there. Another big aspect of the story that can be talked about is the setting. Gaiman sets the story in a stormy, kind of wintry, harsh land. It's set during winter. There's a lot of rain taking place, and the landscape looks and sounds very bleak. In particular, like a lot of areas in the Midwest, when they're traveling through this landscape, are described as being hit with a depression. Like some areas are without that depression because they're under the control of gods, and sacrifice and worship is happening for them. And so that's helping that town stay alive, even if the people in it don't quite know. But a lot of this land has been hit pretty hard. It doesn't sound like that great of a place to live, kind of bleak. And what's more is the gods seem to acknowledge it too. Multiple times throughout the story, the phrase, "this land is bad for gods," is said. That there's just something unnatural about it, something that makes it difficult for gods to truly thrive. This has happened since ancient times, and it continues into the modern day. Even the newer gods are having a hard time thriving in this land, as people seem to forget so quickly. And even though the older gods traveled to America in the minds of their people, like, those people didn't stay for very long, and so the gods were left. And so maybe because things change so fast and the landscape is kind of inhospitable at times, there's just something off about America that makes it kind of bleaker and adding to this overall setting. And you really have to have to sort of ask a question there, like, what about the people? What does it say about the people if the gods themselves cannot thrive in this land? What's the mindset of the average American like? Gaiman kind of offers a little bit of criticism about America in that regard, that maybe it's always sort of been a hostile place, and if gods can't thrive there, what makes it safe for the people to be there? And maybe that kind of explains the new gods that are rising and why they aren't so stable. It's because the people themselves are not doing too well. So kind of offering, a commentary about the state of America, which this was pre 9/11. So even at that point, Gaiman was saying, this is kind of a quaint place to live. But as I mentioned earlier, there is an element of Ragnarok here. This harsh, wintry land is very reminiscent of how Ragnarok is described in Norse mythology. You can see it even in video games like God of War Ragnarok, where it's a very wintry, not a very cozy place to live. And you could argue that this is the great war that's taking place amongst the gods, which arguably is engineered by Odin, so maybe not completely a natural Ragnarok, but who says any Ragnarok is natural? Because in Norse mythology, Odin is always a bit manipulative. You could argue that that was always going to be the case for Ragnarok. And death seems to be a big theme here. So with Ragnarok, you have a lot of death of the gods, and here gods are dying, humans are dying. There's a lot of suffering taking place. So that adds to the overarching setting of this bleak, decrepit, slowly decaying, maybe inhospitable landscape for the gods, but even worse for the people. And this is the sort of end times. But as what some of the characters say, like even the endings are not really endings. So it's not just going to end here. There's going to be more. It just depends on who's controlling it or who's pushing that end forward. Gaiman talks about other interesting aspects of this, or interesting things in this story. He talks about the logistics of belief and worship and what that means for the gods, which is pretty fascinating. Again, he's going in depth into sort of the mythology and cultural worship and those sorts of things here. So I do have to give him a lot of credit for that. And then you see the section of the story, really the last third is excellently written, but basically from the point where Shadow chooses to sacrifice himself in the world tree into the underworld and then to the end of the story, amazingly written. Very fascinating sort of exploration of mythology there. Again, blending the Norse mythology with the Christian religion there, seeing like Shadow's reflection of his own life and the suffering that he's gone through and why that sort of influences how he behaved in actual life, and then his reluctance to come back into the world and how he pleads to the gods to stop fighting, and then his encounter with another form of Odin in Iceland at the end of the story. All amazing sort of aspects of the story, making it really exciting to read. And then mixed with that is Gaiman's prose, where he is one of the best writers. We saw that, or I saw that especially in the Sandman series, but in so many other things, he's just such a fascinating and really thoughtful writer. Like there's no coincidences with Gaiman's writing. Everything he does is with purpose, and you could take apart a lot of what he says in this book line by line and just analyze it for like aspects of mythology, aspects of Shadow's character, just a lot of foreshadowing in this story, a lot of breadcrumbs left around for you to figure out what's going on. But yeah, Gaiman's prose is fantastic and worth the price of admission for this book alone. It's also worth talking about Shadow as a character because he seems sort of passive in this story, kind of distant. After his wife dies, he just wants to be done with everything. And even when he's ready to die, he's like, yeah, I've been ready to die for a while. But what's interesting is like this did not happen after his wife died. As she notes when she's like coming back to life, she says, you know, there were times when I would turn on a light and I would see you and I'd realize you were just sitting there in the darkness doing nothing. You were passive in life. You didn't seem interested in too many things. You weren't actually living. Which Shadow does not like to hear. It's very harsh, especially from someone you love, to hear such things. And so really the purpose of Shadow is to find a reason to live throughout the rest of the story. And it really seems like he finds that purpose with his sacrifice, like sacrificing himself for the cause, which he only later realizes was all worthless anyway. But then he goes and like he made a bargain at the beginning of the story where he would be killed, but you know that bargain was broke by the person who wanted to kill him. He in choosing to die, he's choosing to live in some interesting, convoluted kind of way. But you later see him go to Iceland, so he's making a choice to leave America to go see more of the world and go on a journey and maybe find out more about himself. So this entire adventure has been a push for Shadow to become more than what he was, to recognize that he was kind of hollow and not really living a fulfilling life and do something more. And the way that Shadow, or the way that Neil Gaiman kind of explores that and examines Shadow is really fascinating. I've always felt that he was kind of a passive character. maybe not the most emotionally complex character, but there is a lot here to take apart from Shadow and realize that that Gaiman is writing someone who's pretty deep, who's at a crucial moment in their life, one where you might turn to a god to find that meaning. But here, the gods don't really seem all that interested in helping him. In fact, they want things from him. They want help from him in order to accomplish whatever goals they're trying to set out to do here. So maybe that's how Shadow finds his meaning in the world, and how he realizes that something more needs to be done for himself. There is very little that I don't like about this book. It's hard to find something specific to pinpoint. As I've said, this is probably one of the best books ever written, and it might be flawless. But if I could point out just one thing that doesn't necessarily work in this story, it's that Shadow does feel inconsequential at times, like he's just passing through the story, which you would often get with gods, stories about gods and whatnot. Because you might not be able to kill the god, and you're just sort of dealing with the events that unfold in front of you. And that does happen to Shadow a lot. In fact, other characters seem to make the plot move forward more than him, including Wednesday, Laura, who's killing several of his enemies and seems to make a big choice at the end of the story. Shadow doesn't really do much to facilitate certain events in the story. So it does feel kind of weird. It's not enough to sink the story, but it is something important to observe here. I do feel like that's something in general with Neil Gaiman's writing, is his characters don't really affect the plot so much as they observe it. But again, maybe that's just another theme of Gaiman's writing, is that his characters are omnipotent or sort of all-powerful beings who watch events in the world unfold and reflect on those events. So maybe if you want some more action in your plot, maybe you'd seek something else there. Anyway, those are my thoughts on American Gods by Neil Gaiman. As I mentioned before, it is possibly one of the best books ever written. Very much my opinion there, but I have a feeling that other people share that same thought mindset. I do think this is worth checking out if you haven't done so already. Perhaps, it's one of those books where you'll have to read it more than once in order to fully understand it. I'm pretty sure I'll have to read this a fourth time just to fully grasp everything that I got here. It's a very dense and very meaty kind of book with a lot to chew on. But if you've read it before, or you simply have something to say about my review here, do so below. Would love to hear about you and have a discussion, or hear from you and have a discussion. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this author or this book if they do not already know. Also, join the Discord if you want to have further conversations about such books or even movies. There was also a TV show, which I still need to see, that was adapted about American Gods. And even Neil Gaiman had a part to play in the third season, so that sounds really exciting. I should probably get to that. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and godly travels. Farewell.